Hey there, welcome back. In case we haven't met yet, my name is Dee and I love to code the heck out of Squarespace and teach other designers how to do it too. Today I have a really awesome customization for you. I'm going to be showing you how you can create a loading page or a preload page or however you want to call it. One of those pages that always loads before the rest of the content on the screen that is going to be completely animated and is going to be an awesome addition to any project that you're working with. Now, there are many ways to build this sort of screen, but I'm going to be showing you the most flexible way to do one that is going to have 3 different types of animation. So we're going to have the logo rotating in the middle, then stopping, and then the whole screen is going to slide to one of the sides of the screen to be able to reveal the rest of the content on the page. Now, keep in mind that this customization is going to require just a little bit of HTML, but I promise you it's very simple to implement and you're going to have it up and running in no time. So if this is something that you want to learn how to implement in your current client project, make sure to keep on watching to learn how to make it happen. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to be working with 7.1, but keep in mind that this customization can also be applied to 7.0. So the first thing that we're going to do here is actually build our loading screen. So the way that we're going to be doing this is with a little bit of HTML. So let's go ahead and head over to Settings, Advanced, and Code Injection. Now, keep in mind that if you want to build your loading screen only on one page or a couple of pages, what you can do is implement the HTML that we're going to be building in here inside the code injection section of those specific pages. On the other hand, if you want to have the loading screen show up for pretty much all pages across your site, then you can go ahead and keep it in here where I'm going to be adding it to. So let's go ahead and create our div. We're going to give this div a class of whatever you like. I'm just going to call mine loading screen. And now within this div, I actually want to create a secondary div because I want to have the logo animated separately from the rest of the loading screen. So in order to do that, it's going to be far easier if we have a second div within the full loading screen that is only going to hold our logo, our icon, or whatever it is that you want to have in there. So I'm going to build this div and I'm going to give it a class of loading screen image. And just like that, we have all the HTML we need to be able to build our loading screen. Now let's go ahead and head over to our custom CSS window. So right now you're going to see that nothing's really showing up, and that's totally fine because we don't really have any content within those divs that we just created. That's just a way for us to be able to have like a place inside the website where we're going to be adding our stuff through CSS. So let's go ahead and head over here to Design and Custom CSS so we can start building our loading screen. So I'm going to target the whole loading screen. So remember that this is a class that I gave it. If you're using a different class, make sure to use that in your CSS as well. But in my case, this is called loading screen. So that's the class that I'm going to be using here. Now let's go ahead and actually create this container. So I'm going to give this a height of 100% and a width of 100%. And I'm going to give this a background color. So let's just go ahead and make this like a light gray. And then I'm going to place this as a fixed position element because I want it to expand across the entire height and width of my browser window. So I'm going to set this to position fixed and then give it a left 0 offset and a top 0 offset because I want it to be attached to this top left corner of my website. And then I'm going to go ahead and bring this forward because right now you can see that nothing is really showing up in here. But if we take a look in the inspect element tool, you're going to see that all the way up here, there we go. So this container is basically holding all of the content of the page. And then if we take a look a little bit higher up, you're going to see that this is where the loading screen is located. You can see the div that we created with the other div inside it that currently doesn't really hold anything. But here you can see that if I stand on my loading screen, it actually covers the entire page. The problem is that the content is in front of our loading screen, so we can't really see it. Now, the way that we're going to bring this forward is by giving it a little bit of a set index, or actually a lot of set index. So I'm just going to use a very large number in here to make sure that the screen sits on top of everything else that we have on the page. And just like that, now we have a gray container that is pretty much covering everything. So you can see that if I'm scrolling here, we can't really see anything behind this like gray background that we added in here. That is because this is set to position fixed and it has a height and a width that occupies the whole screen that we have here. So it's just not gonna go anywhere and we can't really see the content behind it. So we're on the right track. Now let's go ahead and add our image. I'm going to be targeting the other container that we had in here. Remember that we have two. We have the loading screen, which is the whole like big container. And then we also have the loading screen image div. And this one is going to hold the icon, the image, the illustration, whatever it is that you want to use in here. Now, there are a couple of ways that we can build this, but I'm going to be using a method that is going to allow me to animate things later on very easily. So I'm going to give this container a height of whatever it is, the size that I want the image to have. So let's just say something like 180 pixels. And I'm gonna make it square. So I'm gonna set the width to 180 pixels as well. Let's give this one a quick background color so that we can start seeing it there. Here you can see that this is by default just aligned to the top left corner of the container holding it, which in this case is our big gray container that we have on here. But I don't really want to have it in this corner, so I'm going to go ahead and move it. I'm going to be using position absolute to move this. Again, there are a couple of ways that we could do this, but considering how I want to modify this, how I want to animate this, I'm going to be using the position absolute method to be able to place this in the center. So I'm going to float this little block here. I'm going to set it to position absolute. And then I'm going to set it 50% from the left side of the screen. And I'm going to set it 50% from the top of the screen. Now you can see that this is not quite in the center. The top left corner of the square is in the dead center of the screen, but the rest of the element isn't. So I'm going to be using here the transform trick to be able to bring this, like the center of this element, to the center of the whole screen. So I'm going to do that by using here transform, translate, and I'm going to move this horizontally minus 50% of the width of the element and minus 50% of the height of the element. And like I said, this is just going to make sure that the center of our element is now aligned with the center of the whole div. Okay, and now that we have this little container in place, let's go ahead and bring in the image because I don't really want this background color. So I'm going to be using here background image, and I'm going to be adding here a URL. So you could go ahead and use a PNG if you wanted to, a JPEG, or you can even use a GIF if that's what you want to have in here. I'm going to use this little static icon that I have in here, which is basically the logo for this trial site that I have. And then I'm going to use a couple of other background properties to be able to set this in the center of this container that I created. So let's start with background position. I want to set this to the center of the container. So you can see that now I see a different part of the logo. And then I'm going to be using here background repeat, no repeat, because just in case we decide to make this slightly smaller than the container we created for it, we're not really going to see duplicates of the same image. And then let's go ahead and set the background size. And here you can decide how big you want to have the logo. If you set it to contain, what's going to happen is that the logo is going to shrink down to match the limits or the dimensions of the container that you created for it. So that means that if you were to increase the dimensions of the red container, so if I were to make this a little bit bigger, you can see how the logo increases in size as well. And then if I were to make that smaller, you can see how the logo reduces in size as well. So this is a very easy way for you to be able to decide how big you want that logo to be just by changing the height and the width of the container. Now, on the other hand, if you wanted to have a background along with whatever image it is that you have in there, what you can do is instead of using the contain keyword for the background size, you can use a specific number. So here we could use something like 90%, and that is going to reduce the size of the image itself, so not the container, but the image itself, to 90% of its original size. If I were to use 50%, there we go, 50%, then you can see how it's half the size the image originally has. So you can definitely play around a lot with this if you want to. I'm just gonna go ahead and keep it as contain. And now I'm going to get rid of this background color because I don't really want it. And just like that, we have our loading screen, and all we have to do now is animate it. So let's go ahead and start by animating the logo. So the way that I want the logo to be animated, and the reason why I have the background separated from the image, is because, again, I want to do two different animations. So I want to do one for the logo itself, and I want to do a second animation for the whole loading screen to go away. So I'm going to animate the logo first by creating a keyframes animation here that we can name however we want. I'm going to make the logo sort of turn on itself. So I'm going to call this animation just scrolling logo, but you can name it anything you want. Just make sure that whenever you're calling that animation inside the CSS, you use the same name that you're using to name it in here inside the keyframes. Okay, so I want the original sort of state for the animation to be what it is right now, so I don't really want this to change. So all I'm going to do in here in the keyframes is add the final stage of the animation. So I'm going to use here the keyword to, which could also be 100%, that's just like the final step of the animation. And I'm going to decide what I want this to do. So basically what we need to think about here is how we want this thing to go from one place to this final step. So what I want the logo to do is basically to rotate on itself. To be able to do that, I'm going to use the transform property, and I'm going to set this to rotate, and I'm going to set this to 360 degrees. So what's going to happen is that during the animation, the logo is going to go from the state where it is right now, which would pretty much be rotate 0 because it doesn't really have a rotation right now. So it's going to go from that 0 to 360 degrees during the time that I decide that this is going to last. So this is why my final step is 360 degrees, because I wanted to do like the full turn. Now, one thing to keep in mind about this particular way that we're animating this element, considering how we set it up in the first place, is that we're also going to have to include the translate function in here. Because the problem is that we're using the same property, the same transform property in here. And so if we add the animation as it is right now to the logo, we're going to move it from its place accidentally, because we're basically replacing the translate that we had before, this -50, that is making sure that the logo is in the center of the screen. We're basically replacing that with rotate 360. So we actually need to keep it in place and rotate it at the same time. So luckily, the transform property actually allows us to set different things. So we can use multiple functions within the same transform property. So all we need to do is just copy this and then add it in here. I'm actually going to add it before. There we go. So now the final stage is going to basically keep the logo in the same place because we're not changing these numbers, but it's also going to allow the logo, or force the logo, to rotate. And now that we have these keyframes here, what we need to do is go back into the element that we want to animate with it. And so I'm going to go in here where it says loading screen image, and I'm going to add the animation property. Now I'm going to add that scrolling logo animation, so I need to add the name in here. So once again, if you were to change the name of your animation down here, make sure to change it up here as well. And then just to test it out, I'm going to go ahead and set this animation to infinite so that it runs continuously without stopping, just because I want to see what it looks like. And now I need to decide how long I want the whole animation to be, like how long I want the whole rotation to take. So I think I'm going to be using here something like 3 seconds. And once I have that in place, you can see how all of a sudden now our animation kicks in and we have a rotating logo. You're going to see that right now there's sort of like a stopping step that is happening there, and that is because of the type of animation that we're using. So we haven't really set sort of like, it's not exactly a transition, but we haven't really told the browser how smoothly we want this animation to run. So if we want to change this, because we want this to be like a continuous turn without actually seeing sort of like that original step, what we can do is just add in here the keyword linear. And this is just going to make sure that there is no difference between the initial state and the final state of the animation. So it's just like a continuous scroll, and we don't really get to see that start and stopping stage of the effect. Now, here's the thing. I don't really want this animation to just go round and round indefinitely. So I'm actually going to give the animation a specific number of turns or number of times that the animation should run so that it stops at some point. And then once it stops, I'm going to go ahead and make the whole loading screen go away. So I'm going to change this keyword of infinite that we have in here for a specific number. And that number is going to be the number of times that I want the animation to go through. So in this case, it's basically going to be the number of times that I want this thing to go like around. So let's go ahead and set this to 2. And once I do that, you're going to see that this stops because it has been a while since this has been turning. So the two turns have already completed. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and then I'm going to refresh the screen so that we can actually see the whole animation, and it's only going to do 2 turns now. So we have here 1 turn and then 2 turns, and then the animation stops altogether. So this is what I want. Now here, of course, you can decide if you want to keep it infinite, you can absolutely do that. If you wanted to do just 1 turn, then you can go ahead and just use the number 1. If you wanted to do, I don't know, 5 turns, then you can go ahead and change that number as well. I think I'm gonna keep it as 1 because otherwise it's going to take too long for the whole animation to complete before we remove the loading screen. So if we keep it to 1, you can see how it turns 1 time and then it stops. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to build the animation for the whole loading screen to go away. And then to be able to sort of match the end of one animation with the beginning of the other one, what we're going to do is just basically consider the time that the scrolling logo is taking and then add a little bit more time before the other animation starts so that everything sort of blends in together really nicely. Now let's go ahead and take this step by step. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to build the animation for the whole loading screen. Now here you need to decide how you want the loading screen to go away. In this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how you can make it go away by sliding, whether that is to the right side, to the left side, to the top, or to the bottom. But keep in mind that you can also make it fade away if you use the opacity property instead. So let's go ahead and set up an animation for this to go away. I'm going to create here another keyframes animation, keyframes, and then I'm going to call this whatever I want. So I don't know, goodbye screen. All right, that's going to be the name of my animation. And now what I want to do here is, once again, I want the initial state to be how the screen is right now. So I don't really need to add anything else to the initial state here in the animation. All I need to do is create that final state. So I just need to tell the browser where I want this loading screen to end up after the animation completely runs. Now, depending on where you want the loading screen to go, you can use different values. So here we're going to be using the transform property for all cases, like for all edges, and we're going to be using the translate function. Now for the translate function here, we just need to set one value or like one coordinate because we only need to tell the browser where we want the screen to slide into. So if we want to move this horizontally, we need to use the translate x function. And then if we use 100%, a positive value, then the screen is going to shift or slide to the right side. If we use a negative number, then it's going to slide into the left side. And then if we use the translate y function, if we keep a negative 100%, then what's going to happen is that the loading screen is going to slide upwards. And if we use a positive number, we're going to slide the screen downwards. And the reason why I'm using 100% is because I want the whole screen to disappear. Keep in mind that this 100% when using the translate function refers to the width or the height of the element itself. So if you move it 100% of its own width or its own height, you're pretty much going to make it disappear because it's going to go away from the screen where it's sitting right now. So for this particular customization, I'm going to be using here translate x minus 100% because I want the screen to be pulled towards the left side. Now let's go ahead and add the animation to the loading screen container. Right now we're not animating the image anymore. We're going to be animating the whole loading screen. So I'm going to set the animation in here and I call this one goodbye screen. And then this one, we're going to go ahead and make it move in about, I don't know, we want this to slide fairly quickly. So I think like 0.5 seconds would be a good time for the whole loading screen to disappear. And now to make sure that the animation only runs once and it stays in the final state, so basically it stays hidden, like the whole loading screen stays hidden, I'm going to be using the keyword forwards. So if we were to use infinite here, then it would repeat like showing and sliding back out. If we were to use a specific number, then the animation is going to run only once. but we're going to stick with the initial state of the animation once it's done, which is basically having the screen showing, which is what we don't want. So we're going to be using the forwards keyword instead, which means that it's going to run once and stop once it reaches the end of the animation, which in our case means that the screen is not going to be showing in here because it's going to be hidden somewhere on the outside of the browser window. So just to test it out, I'm going to go ahead and leave the animation as it is. And so you're going to see that in 0.5 seconds, the screen moves away. So now if I were to modify things down here, so if I were to modify the keyframe and then maybe use a positive number and then disable the animation and then run it again, you're going to see how now the screen slides to the right side. And again, if we change this and now we use a translate Y function and then disable and enable the animation again, you can see how everything moves downwards. And if we use a negative number, like a negative translate Y number, then what's going to happen is that the animation or the screen is going to slide all the way up. So you can see how you can modify the way that the screen leaves the browser window by just changing a couple of things in here in the animation. And like I said, I'm going to leave it like this, translate X minus 100%. And then here's the thing. I want to link this animation to the scrolling logo, like I mentioned before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of a delay to the animation. I'm going to disable it here for a second so that we can see the screen. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take into consideration how long the scrolling logo animation is taking. So in my case, it's 3 seconds. And then I'm going to add a little bit more time to the delay of the loading screen so that after the logo stops, like stops scrolling, there's a little bit of a time, it could be like 1 second or less than 1 second before the whole loading screen goes away. So that's going to create like a really cool effect. So let's go ahead and do maybe 3.5 seconds. So it's going to be, like I said, 3 seconds because that's how long this scrolling animation takes to complete, plus 0.5 seconds, which is going to allow us to see the whole screen before it goes away. So now that we have that there, you're going to see that it takes 3.5 seconds before the loading screen goes away. And now if we reload the whole animation, because here, this one, remember that it's only meant to run once, so that's why we weren't seeing it scrolling or like rolling around. So now if I reload the frame, you're going to see that as soon as it loads, we have that scrolling motion, it stops, and then 0.5 seconds, everything goes away. Now, last but not least, and this is completely optional, you can modify the way that the animation behaves. So just like with the scrolling logo, we went ahead and added this linear keyword to make sure that the steps were sort of smooth so you can really see the starting and the ending of the like the scrolling logo. We can do something similar with the loading screen. Now, in this case, we don't really get to see the starting and stopping point of the animation. We basically just see the end of it. So what we can do is give the animation sort of like a cooler way for the whole sliding motion to happen. And one of the ways that we can easily do this is by using something called the Cubic-bezier curve, which I probably pronounced wrong, but it doesn't really matter. The important part is that this can help us create really cool animations. So there's a site called I'm not gonna pronounce it again, .com. And then here you can basically play around with the little diagram curve that we have in here, and this is just going to create for you the code that you need to be able to achieve that particular animation. So here you get to see an example to compare what you're doing, which is the pink part, with a regular one of the easing types that we have for animations. So I like to compare always with the linear one. So if we click here on go, you're going to see how the linear one moves, well, linearly. So you can see how it starts and it stops and it sort of continues the same speed, let's say, across the entire animation. But then you're going to see how the pink one behaves differently depending on how you move things in here in the curve. So you can see how now that one actually starts really strongly and then ends a little bit softly. So it ends a little bit more slowly. And then if we move here things to the other side or something kind of weird like that, see that if I click in here, this one sort of slinks to the back and then goes to the front, and then the same thing here to this side. So you can can definitely play around with this tool to try to find an animation that you want to use. This one actually looks pretty cool, but it really depends on how you want to animate things. The other thing that you can do is to simply type into Google like cubic, I'm not going to pronounce it again, examples, and then for example you can find something like this, which is a really cool coat pen that I found. This is by Bennet. I'm not sure who that person is, but this is really awesome. And then here you can see a couple of examples of these type of easings that he created. And if you want to use one of them, then what you can do is just simply stand on this so that you can check it out, you know, without like looking at all of the other ones. So here you can see how this one moves. And then if you like it, you can grab it and just use it in your code. So I'm actually going to be using, let's see, this one looks pretty cool. So you have to try to like picture how your element is going to look like. So I feel like this one will look kind of odd for that loading screen. This one looks pretty good, but I think this is the one that I liked. Yeah, you can see how it does like that sort of like click thing. I don't know, it looks really cool. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this easing, and I'm going to go back into the code, and then we're just going to add that in here. So I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to load the site inside a guest tab, because it's just going to be easier to see things here. So I'm just going to refresh this, and now we get to see our scrolling animation stop, and then the whole loading screen goes away. All right, and that's everything that I have for you today. I really hope that you enjoyed this tutorial and that you were able to implement the preloading screen onto your Squarespace site. If you found this tutorial helpful, make sure to give this video a big thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss out on future content just like this one, and I will see you next time.